Happy Friday, DawgNation. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Getting closer to the start of the early signing period next Wednesday. We're going to cover a lot of that on today's program. We're glad you're with us. You've picked a good time. Jeff Sintel going to be here later on, too. And one of the things in particular I'm going to talk to Jeff about is the very interesting piece that he had with five-star linebacker Nakobe Dean. Jeff was there on the side of the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star game earlier this week. Got some great stuff from Dean. We'll talk to Jeff about that. We're going to start, though, with Alabama fans maybe a little bit salty about Georgia and some of its recruiting success as of late. I think you'll like this. Let's do it off the top of the program. As DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, begins right now.
From DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Georgia has had quite a run of success here in recruiting over the last couple of years, and some Alabama fans are not too happy about that, apparently at least. There's a little bit of saltiness, or whatever you want to say, in regards to some of the way this has kind of gone down. And I think from the Alabama perspective, and listen, the dark cloud that hangs over this entire discussion is credit where credit's due. Alabama has won the last two head-to-head meetings against Georgia in each of the last two seasons in heartbreaking fashion. For your UGA fan, you can't deny that. But for a brand new coach in Kirby Smart, working his way up the coaching ranks here, the only way to knock off and topple a giant like Alabama is step by step, player by player, every single day on the recruiting trail, presenting an option other than Alabama that you can convince players to say, you know what, that's the better fit, that's the better overall choice for me. That is the way that the Georgia program is being built up. And as all the cliches you want to use go, Rome wasn't built in a day, blah, 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 blah. These kinds of massive transformations take time. I think some Alabama fans would like to have you believe, because Alabama has won the SEC championship this season, won the national championship game a year ago, that there is no transformation taking place. Much like the old Who song says, the new boss is the same as the old boss, and there's nothing new to see here when it comes to the SEC. But as you head towards last year's early signing period and eventually on the conclusion of the 2018 recruiting cycle, we saw that Georgia was a formidable force to be reckoned with when it came to recruiting. And this year, obviously, Alabama's doing a great job building its way towards a pretty stellar and impressive 2019 class. Guys like Bud Elliott from SB Nation say that Alabama's already essentially locked up the number one class from a mathematical standpoint. I'll let other people crunch the numbers on that. All I'm looking at are the names that are still out there that Georgia's targeting or has targeted, and the head-to-head battles that Georgia's doing with Alabama. And I think there is a very good chance that some of these go the way of the Georgia Bulldogs. And I think there's a very good chance that the immediate aftermath of that, plenty of Alabama fans will not be happy about it. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. Roll Bama Roll is a Alabama fan site. It is connected to SBNation.com, so from that standpoint, it's got a little bit of credibility. There's a little bit of a extra attention paid to a site like this, just given the fact that it's connected to the SB Nation network. And when five-star offensive lineman Clay Webb chose Georgia this week out of Oxford, Alabama, that obviously opened up some eyes and raised some eyebrows of people who said, wait a second, all of a sudden now this Georgia recruiting machine has been built up in such a way that Georgia can go into Oxford, Alabama, a school that in the past would be kind of a feeder system more for Alabama or Auburn, and especially in this case Alabama, and get a five-star offensive lineman out of the state? Is this really what Georgia's doing from a recruiting standpoint right now? Some Alabama people will tell you, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. Clay Webb had ties to Georgia, and Clay Webb, was going to be Georgia-bound no matter what. And in fact, let me show you what Roll Bama Roll wrote about this on the heels of the Clay Webb decision. I'll read this quote to you. The writer says, we at RBR, which stands for Roll Bama Roll, have been speculating that Clay Webb choosing Georgia, was more of Kirby shenanigans. And don't you love that phrase? Kirby shenanigans. Alabama fans worried about Kirby shenanigans. The blogger goes on to write, our theory goes that Webb wanted to commit to UGA, but their staff asked him to wait and keep it quiet so Kirby could build his recruitment up and make it look like he snatched Webb away from Saban's clutches at the last second, and they were building some kind of momentum. Once again, that was from a recent post at Roll Bama Roll, the Bama fan site connected to SBNation.com. And there is a lot of anger seemingly in that about what Kirby Smart is building from a recruiting standpoint. There is no perception needed here. Georgia did beat Alabama for Clay Webb. And even if it was, thought in some circles that was going to happen for a while, it doesn't change the fact that Alabama was recruiting Webb, was trying to get him in the fold, and could not overtake Georgia for this. I mean, that is a fact. And in terms of trying to build the perception that Georgia has recruiting momentum, I don't think you need to look too far beyond Webb to see other examples of recruiting momentum being built for the program. I think that there are a lot of Alabama folks, and I don't have any, level of, disrespect for Roll Bama Roll. I actually think they do some pretty good work from time to time. But I do think that there is a certain thought process among many Alabama fans that it's somehow a birthright, somehow an expectation that Alabama just ought to be able to get every player that it wants, certainly from within the state of Alabama, but even beyond the state of Alabama as well, that somehow if Bama wants a player, there's some sort of weird thing afoot, some sort of shenanigans in play if that guy would rather go somewhere else. But what you have seen from Kirby Smart consistently over the course of what will be his, fourth recruiting cycle here at the University of Georgia is that Smart has hired good assistants. And those assistants are really good at forming and forging relationships. And it's ultimately the relationships that recruits have with Kirby and his assistants that make them want to come to the University of Georgia. Let me give you an example from the man we're just discussing, Clay Webb. Our Jeff Sintel, who we'll hear from later on in our program, had a chance to spend some time with Clay Webb on Monday after he did officially choose Georgia. And Webb made, in no uncertain terms, very clear about why it was he chose UGA. Here is Clay Webb.
What was the reason why it's Georgia? What did it come down to for you?
Coach Pittman. I want him to coach me.
You've kind of felt that way. You felt strongly about Sam for a while, huh? When you made the decision, when you told him, what was his reaction?
I think he's pretty happy.
Listen, here's the thing we know about Sam Pittman. Not only is he happy about Clay Webb, he's just sort of happy in general. He creates a vibe on the recruiting trail that players like Webb want to be a part of. I love the way that Webb says this. I want him to coach me. I want the relationship I have to be even deeper here over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. I want to get closer to him, and that's the kind of stuff that works for Georgia. And here's where things are potentially bad news for Alabama. It's not just Pittman on the offensive line who has a way of cultivating this kind of stuff. It's the other coaches and the other position groups as well. And we may see more fruit of that in head-to-head battles with Alabama during this recruiting cycle. As I said a moment ago, Jeff Sintel is going to be with us in a couple of minutes. One of the things when Jeff joins us that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is a recent piece that he wrote about five-star linebacker Nakobe Dean. Jeff had a chance to speak to Dean at the side of the Mississippi-Alabama All-Star game here this week. And some of the same stuff that Clay Webb just said about wanting to play for Sam Pittman, you get the sense that guys like Nakobe Dean see some of the same kind of stuff with the position coaches and the UGA assistants who've been influential with them. Let me show you this quote from Dean and see if this doesn't sound a little bit to you like some of the stuff that Webb has said. You can read the entire piece at DawgNation.com, but in terms of Dean's comparison of UGA and Alabama, he says they, meaning Georgia, have a similar culture as Bama. But listen to this now. Listen to this very carefully. But it's a little different feel at Georgia, Nakobe Dean says. It's a little more of a homey feel. It's business, but it's a little less. It's a little less business when it comes to what's going on there at the University of Georgia. So much the same way Clay Webb seemingly feels at home at the University of Georgia, so much so that he gave Georgia his commitment on Monday. Seems like you're hearing some of those same kind of things from Nakobe Dean there, too. Now, I'll never pretend to tell you that I know for a fact that Dean's going to choose Georgia. There are plenty of reasons to believe that Alabama may still be the point spread favorite for his services. But I will say this, and I'm going to talk to Jeff Sintel more about this in a moment. I will say that I am more hopeful about Dean at UGA based on what Dean told Jeff this week than I was before that article at DawgNation.com was printed. And I think it is an example here of, for Alabama fans, they're going to have to get used to a new normal in the world of recruiting. That it's not just a weird set of circumstances that would cause a player to choose Georgia over Alabama here in 2019. Much the same way we saw Georgia go head-to-head and win a few times in 2018. In the case of Clay Webb, that's already happened. In the case of Nakobe Dean, that might happen, to say nothing of guys like Trey Sanders, who I think Georgia's very much in the mix for, potentially even maybe Evan Neal, the five-star offensive lineman. We'll have more on that in a moment. This is a day and age where Kirby Smart has built up a recruiting behemoth that can absolutely make a pitch for recruits that in some cases Alabama cannot match. And there are guys like Webb and maybe even others who are going to prefer the Georgia message over Alabama's, and we could see more examples of that starting next Wednesday when the early signing period begins. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Marco's Pizza. Hello to you. Thank you for being with us live here on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter feed, or maybe you prefer the radio there in Athens on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We love being on there at noon each and every day, or in podcast form, pretty much wherever you can find podcasts, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. We post a link to the show every day, also Apple, Android, everything else. We're just really glad to have you on the program and really appreciate Marco's Pizza for making it all possible. And by now you know the truth that Primo is always on the menu at Marco's Pizza. It's dough made fresh. It's a sauce from the original Gianmarco family recipe, and it's 3 signature cheeses blended together on every single pizza. You can order yours today from Marcos.com. That's a great way to say hello, Primo, this weekend. All right, as promised, we will talk to Jeff Sintel in a couple of minutes. Before that, though, there are a couple of things I want to do, and we were talking about this before the show began today. So, McCole Hardman, the Georgia wide receiver and kick returner, had kind of an interesting tweet. I will admit that left to my own devices, I'm not quite sure I would have 100% interpreted this the same way that a lot of other people seem to, because I looked at the responses to the tweet, and almost everyone seems to think that this is McCole Hardman proclaiming that he's coming back to the University of Georgia for his senior season. Let me show you, if you're watching on video, the tweet from Hardman, and if you're listening, I'll describe it to you. It's a beautiful picture of McCole, first of all, and then it says, it's still money to be made, and he gives you the emoji for his number 4 and the bag of money there. And if you look at the responses, there are 100-something responses or something like that. If you look at all these responses, there is clearly a theme in place that Georgia fans think, oh, that's Hardman saying that he's coming back for one final year at Georgia, and he's looking to improve upon his draft status as a Georgia Bulldog again next year, which obviously would be good news given the fact that Hardman's a terrific kick returner and a valuable part of Georgia's wide receiver depth. That's the way that people interpreted that. As I said, if it was up to me, I don't know that I would quite take as much from that. I also don't believe that Twitter is a binding referendum either. The guys have a tendency to say one thing on Twitter, then maybe change their mind a little bit later on. I did have a chance to talk to Hardman about this subject back early December after the SEC championship game. At that time, were you considering and have you given much thought to the NFL draft? Hardman said then that that was not something he had put a lot of process into yet. Here was Hardman back at the beginning of the month.
You have a versatile skill set. You can return kicks. You've proven yourself to be a very good wide receiver. That's a pretty valuable commodity for the NFL. Is that something that you're going to think long and hard about at the end of this season of maybe leaving after your junior year to go to the NFL?
I ain't putting no much thought in it, man. Just focus on the season, focus on us right now, and just try to finish, and that'll come at a later time.
That was the right thing for Hardman to say then, but obviously it's an important choice he's going to have to make at some point. And as Georgia gets ready to get going with the Sugar Bowl practices, there are a few other guys who are strongly considering this too. Guys like Riley Ridley, you got to think. Guys like Isaac Nada, you would have to imagine. There are a few of these names that are going to get a lot of attention, probably, not before the game. It seems like this team's focus is right where it needs to be in terms of being ready to go out and take on Texas on January 1st. But I'm talking about the moment that game is over with. A lot of these guys will either be ready to make their announcements or really get serious about their process. And so we will indeed see if the tweet from Hardman ends up being a true reflection of how he's feeling there. I know for a lot of Georgia fans, they remember the great moment after the 2016 season when a lot of guys like Lorenzo Carter and Nick Chubb and Sony Michel and Davin Bellamy, when they chose to come back, to say nothing of guys like Dominic Sanders and Aaron Davis, who kind of chose the same thing. They were facing at least similar decisions. That decision for those veterans to come back really benefited Georgia on the field in 2017, and I think some Georgia fans would love to see a repeat of that heading into the 2019 season as well. So we shall follow that and see where that goes, but that was the tweet from McCole Hardman that got a little bit of attention. All right, with that said, let me transition here. I mentioned the Georgia practices. Let me look at everything else that's going to be happening over the weekend, the next couple of days here for Georgia as a part of our Kroger checklist. We do the Kroger checklist here on DawgNation Daily every single Friday to give you an idea of some of the stuff happening around DawgNation. And I'm actually really excited about this. We got a couple basketball games both tonight and tomorrow. We have not had Georgia basketball in forever. They've been dealing with final exams there on campus. Both basketball teams have kind of been away from the spotlight for a while because of that. But the Lady Dogs going to host Villanova tonight at 7 p.m. Joni Taylor's club getting back in action. And then Tom Crean's team, once again, as I said, it feels like it's been a million years since Crean's team has played. But tomorrow they will be hosting Arizona Arizona State. So 2 pretty fun basketball games here at Stegman Coliseum over the course of the next couple of nights as both the Lady Dogs and Tom Crean's men's basketball team get back to action. Really looking forward to seeing that. I know for a lot of Georgia fans, this is the time of year when you put your attention kind of more squarely on basketball and that sort of spot in between the end of the regular season and the start of the bowl season for Georgia. So I'm sure there'll be a few extra eyeballs on both the Lady Dogs and the men's team over the course of the next couple of nights. Of course, the football practices do begin this weekend as well as Georgia gets ready for the Sugar Bowl, and it seems like, as I said, they're doing so with a pretty good level of focus and momentum. I do believe that Georgia wants to put a nice cap on its 2018 season, so we'll see that happening against Texas as those practices get going here this weekend. And then early signing period, don't forget, that gets going on December the 19th. That's Wednesday, so there is a lot of action and a lot of ground to cover between now and then as that gets ready to get going. Our Kroger checklist here on DawgNation Daily every single week is brought to you by friends at Kroger, and they've got a great offer for you right now that I want to make sure you take advantage of. You can get 3 times the fuel points when you buy select meat and seafood like pork back ribs and Kroger shrimp at your local Atlanta Kroger. You can download the coupon from the app, and you can start saving today. So really good stuff there from Kroger here on the Kroger checklist, and it's really good to have you today here on DawgNation Daily. So there is a lot of ground we got to cover in recruiting. I just talked a little bit about what Jeff wrote about Nakobe Dean. I found that to be fascinating. Those are not the only fascinating storylines and subplots that are out there right now. Let's see if we can cover them all as we welcome him into DawgNation Daily, and glad to have you with us as well.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Always fun on a Friday to have Jeff Sintel here on DawgNation Daily. He has been burning it up on the roads of the last few days. There with Nakobe Dean earlier in the week, of course, in Atlanta with Jaden Hazelwood and Tresman Marshall a little earlier this week, too. John Rice Plumlee kind of mixed in the mix there, too, and no telling where to come in the days ahead. Jeff, we appreciate you putting so many miles in your car and burning the candle at both ends. We're glad to have you on DawgNation Daily here today. Hope you're doing well. In fact, how are you doing?
Hey, Brandon, I'm good. I guess stretch run time here in recruiting season, and I would also like to share that yesterday at the Alabama-Mississippi practices, there was one player on the Mississippi squad who clearly looked a notch above everybody else on that field, and that was 5-star Nakobe Dean.
Is that right? So in-person eye test, he seems to pass that test, and that for a lot of Georgia fans is really exciting to hear. And, you know, Jeff, I want to start with Dean. I mentioned this on the show before you joined us, and I tweeted this out a couple of minutes ago as well. As someone who's obviously a partisan and wants Dean to be a part of Georgia's class, I found myself more hopeful about Dean based on your piece at DawgNation than really any piece of information we've gotten on Dean at all over the last few months. I have said to a lot of people, both publicly and privately, that I don't really consider Georgia to be the point spread favorite for Dean, to use a euphemism. I've just never really thought that Georgia was 51% or more likely to get Dean. But when you hear him say, you know, both these schools, Alabama and Georgia, it's a business at both places, and they're serious about football at both places, but Georgia feels a little more homey. I like that word from him, that it's a business, but it's a little less of a business. He goes on to sort of describe the relaxed feel around his time spent around Georgia coaches. To me, that means something. And for a guy that I know really values academics, and, you know, people can insert their own joke there when in the UGA-Alabama comparison on that, but you know, when you think about the things that are important to Dean from his own words, it's hard for a Georgia fan not to read your piece at DawgNation.com and not at least come away with an optimistic assessment. And you're obviously there in person. You're there to capture these quotes from Dean. How did you receive the information you got from him? Do you think it's accurate for a Georgia fan to feel pretty good about what Dean told you?
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. I just think there's the air of close race, close, hard-fought race, but Georgia might be distinguishing itself in this one. That's what you hear that from reporters that are covering it. You hear that from rival school fan base reporters. You know, the thing to me that stood out is, you know, and it was funny because Nakobe even couched his words when he met the media this week. He said, someone asked him a question about what's it like with all these other guys. This guy's committed to Ole Miss. This guy's committed to Alabama. This guy's committed to, LSU, they're all working you, they're all after you, they're wanting to know what's going on, and they're like, well, Nakobe was like, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, she said, their questions, they want to know the raw from me. They want to know what's going on because they know I'm not giving the media anything. I'm not telling the media anything right now. But I thought that homie quote, and, there's a reason why I put that up way high up in the story. I thought that homie quote was pretty interesting. Maybe in the realm of what he's not giving anyone and what he's not sharing with anyone, I think that was maybe one of the more revealing comparative contrast answers regarding Alabama and Georgia. And I would probably venture a guess to say that the decision does eventually come down to Georgia and Alabama. I think LSU is in there as well. But the thing there was, Nakobe also found interesting is, and it kind of intersects right now with the John Rice Plumlee story, was I remember I pulled him aside and started talking to him at the end of the second practice, or the first practice, I believe that was on Wednesday. And John Rice Plumlee comes running by, and he's like hopping up and down. You could articulate that to say kid on Christmas morning seeing what he wants under the tree. But he basically said the phrase like, I don't know, like Candyman or something. He's like, he coming. and that was totally, I didn't ask him or anything. That's one of the things recruits do is this during this stage when, Malik Herring used to do this a lot even when he wasn't committed to Georgia. He would just come up around guys that were being interviewed, and he would like wave a Georgia flag or put his arms around a kid, and he would just say, a phrase like "Go Dogs" or whatever. That's sort of the thing that happened there with John Rice Plumlee. He just said, "He coming," and then kind of framed up his shoulders a little bit, gave him a little bitty hug, and then just went on his way with his 4.4 speed back to the locker room.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting stuff. And to go back to something we talked about before the start of the show here, or at the beginning of the show, I think this is an example of something that I don't know that Georgia could have done 2 years ago in recruiting. Go head-to-head with Alabama for a five-star linebacker and actually win that battle. But we have seen, examples with Clay Walker last year, Clay Webb this year, other names you kind of want to point to here where Georgia is a program of the prowess now where it can win this head-to-head battle. Now, it doesn't mean it will win the head-to-head battle, but Georgia is a program now of a stature where it is a reasonable outcome, even if, as I said before, maybe Georgia's not exactly the majority favorite, but this is still an outcome that can happen. In a way, back in 2016, Georgia just wasn't going to be able to do that. Or maybe even in 2017, a lot of examples where Georgia just wasn't going to quite be able to do that. A lot has changed in those 2 years since then, though, has it not?
Yeah, it has. And let's make no mistake here about this Nakobe Dean recruitment. Should Georgia win this recruiting race for Nakobe Dean, I think this will be Georgia still coming back from an underdog's perspective. And the reason why I say that is I kind of dropped a few nuggets on the forum this morning as I try to sip my morning coffee and go through what everybody's talking about. And to me, there are several factors here that sometimes work in Alabama's favor in the Alabama-Georgia head-to-head. One is that it's about a 6.5, 7-hour drive for Nakobe Dean and his family to get to Georgia from his home right outside of Memphis. Tuscaloosa is only about 3.5 hours. So I think that maybe the biggest thing Georgia has had to overcome here, if apples to apples, if everything's the same, is why keep driving the car another 3 hours when everything might be there in Tuscaloosa? The other thing that I thought was highly interesting is that, what I've learned through my reporting is that the Dean family kind of values the Alabama degree as highly as it does the Georgia degree. Now, that might be some smart, clever marketing by Alabama's recruiting staff and their football staff, but he wants to major in engineering, and the engineering program at Alabama is still a lot more developed than its comparative degree path there in Athens at Georgia. And so that's one thing that they've taken a notice of is that, the academics head for head, Georgia doesn't have a clear advantage. It might even be a greater than or equal to thing in terms of engineering for them in Alabama. The other thing that you sit there and you think about when, these schools come together for Nakobe Dean is it's going to be about fit. It's going to be about familiarity. It's going to be about football. And I say this a lot. I think of this a lot when I think of the Nakobe Dean situation. Nakobe Dean is going to play great football. He's going to be a player kind of like Roquan Smith, that no coach is ever going to have to yell at a lot. He's going to take care of his grades. He's going to handle his business. He's going to be respectful to adults at all times. He just needs a bubble. And when I mean a bubble, it's a support staff. It's a safe campus environment. It's being surrounded by peers that are also excelling and have their eyes and their mindsets on their 40-year future and not their 5 to 10-year future. Helping him, shaping him into being a man. He's looking for the best bubble that will surround himself for all the other things in college besides what he knows he can handle with his own acumen.
Well,
So that's the huge thing there.
if they like the Alabama diploma so much, we should let them know they can buy one of those at Piggly Wiggly, and then he can come play his football career at the University of Georgia. I'm kidding, Jeff. I'm kidding. I'm obviously kidding. Let me talk about somebody different here for a moment, and that's Trey Sanders. I think when you spoke to us on Tuesday, you said that conventional wisdom had Sanders visiting Florida this weekend, and I believe you said that was going to be an unofficial visit. Is that kind of still the same deal with Sanders here on this final visit weekend before the period begins on Wednesday? Is he expected to be in Gainesville here?
What I feel will happen there is I feel that Trey Sanders will be in Gainesville on an unofficial visit. It would be very interesting if he does not show up. Maybe Dan Mullen will have to offer the treat or the caveat that he'll put every member of his family, including his fourth grade teacher, in a Gators jersey for the photo op there. But that's something to watch for there. But again, this is the reality. Alabama's number one in recruiting. They'll probably still sign more players than Georgia this year. Georgia's number two. I think Georgia's shot at overtaking Alabama for number one or just finishing a solid number two, I think it will hinge on three players. I think it will hinge on Trey Sanders' decision. I think it will hinge on Nakobe Dean's decision. And I think it will also hinge on the decision made by Evan Neal. And then after that, depending on where the cards fall with that one, they also had to include Clay Webb in there as well. Depending on where the cards fall on that one, that will determine who could do what to earn the eventual crown on February the 6th.
And I think you're bringing up a really good point. I want to talk to you about a few of those things there. A lot of information, but on the subject of like the number one class, as a fan, I've said before, I love the idea of being number one in recruiting. I treat it as a pretty big deal last year, not just that Georgia signed an elite class, but it got the number one ranking. If this year's class isn't number one, and given the number of players that Alabama seemingly is going to sign, mathematically it's going to be hard for Georgia to do. As a fan, I'm fine with not being number one, and I love how you describe this. As long as it's a solid number two, a Sanders or the possibility of an Evan Neal, who we'll talk about in a moment, or a Dean. That's an example of Georgia getting who it wants and getting who it needs. And, if the overall score doesn't add up to be, higher than Alabama's, that's fine because, I don't really know of guys who are available in December who would be out there that I'd want more than them. So mathematically, if Georgia could kind of collect some of those names and still not finish number one, at that point in time, I've sort of done everything that I sort of want Georgia to do. Now, obviously, that'll still leave the the Elams of the world and the Stevensons of the world, and I guess even to a certain extent, maybe possibly even Darnell Wright, beyond January to kind of think about there a little bit. But I love the way that you just said that if Georgia were to get Sanders and Georgia were to get Dean and maybe even possibly Evan Neal, even if it's not number one class, that's Georgia really cleaning up heading into the end of the early signing period.
Yeah, Brendan, you have piqued my reporter's curiosity right here, so let's do some interactive D&D here. I'm going to propose the following. Georgia can finish with Trey Sanders, Nakobe Dean, Tyreke Stevenson. And I'll just leave it at those three right there. If that happens, do you have any, and everybody else please jump in on this on the comment section, but if those three players end up Georgia Bulldogs, do you really care where the class is ranked after that, or are you going to be good with those results rather than that artificial ranking?
Yeah, for me personally, those three names you just mentioned, that would be enough for me to be happy, even if, numerically ends up being whatever. That's Georgia taking care of its business. Now, I'm always greedy. What I do notice that you didn't mention there was another elite offensive tackle, and I obviously have my mind on that a little bit, even if Georgia's not a likely landing spot, as I've said before, not a point spread favorite for Neal or eventually Darnell Wright. I would obviously really like to see Georgia get one of those, but the three names you just mentioned, regardless of ranking, is Georgia doing a pretty good job here in 2019 and certainly putting itself in a position to be even more, even deeper and more talented on the field in 2019 and 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, see, Brandon, I got you in the briar patch there a little bit with that question because I purposely started with 3 names, and you were already good with those 3 names. But I left out an important 4th name. Now let's add Trey Sanders, Tyreke Stevenson, Nakobe Dean, and Jaden Hazelwood to the mix. Would you be over the moon happy with those 4 names, regardless of where the class winds up?
Yeah, I definitely would, and you're right. I guess there's a part of me that thinks that Hazelwood's eventually going to be good news. So maybe I didn't think about him as much not being included in there, although I should. This is still a contested recruitment, but obviously Hazelwood without the ranking would definitely make me very happy. I don't think you need to be number 1 if you're handling those needs, and those 4 names are critical recruits for Georgia, regardless of what they do to Georgia's overall final score.
Yeah, and this is the preliminary thought I have because I'm already thinking about what we'll write on the 19th and what we'll write on the 20th. I will feel this way. I will feel if Georgia can land Hazelwood, Dean, Stevenson on the 5th, because this might be talking about the 5th, whether we put the bow on the 2019 class in finality, maybe February the 7th. If the Georgia class includes Hazelwood, includes Dean, includes Stevenson, I feel, and then Trey Sanders, of course, as well, I feel that Georgia, after the 4th full cycle, but the 3rd full recruiting year of Kirby Smart's recruitment, if they can close with those 4 names, at least those 4 names, I would probably feel very comfortable writing that Georgia now has the class to beat Alabama for a national championship, to have a fully stacked and loaded out, tricked out roster capable of competing for the championship and beating a team like Alabama. I think those pieces are still crucial.
I think that's a really strong statement, Jeff. I really do. And speaking of Stevenson and to a certain extent Hazelwood, although a little less so, what did you make of what happened at Miami yesterday, where they had, if I'm looking at the information correct, 4 decommitments yesterday? 3 of those were 3 stars. There was a 4-star Keyshawn Washington, a 4-star safety that decommitted. That's a 2020 recruit, I guess. But 4 decommitments from the program yesterday, kind of on the heels of Manny Diaz taking the Temple job. Is Tyreke Stevenson paying attention to that? Is Hazelwood, to the extent that it doesn't sort of send a very positive message about Miami, his own side of the ball offense was kind of a mess for the Hurricanes this year. There are at least 2 examples where Georgia's going head-to-head with Miami for recruiting, and as it stands right now, Miami would appear to be a little bit of a program in turmoil after losing Diaz. Does that impact Tyreke Stevenson in your mind?
Oh, he's definitely going to look at that. I think Hazelwood, when you saw some of our coverage of late about how they want to win, how Jaden Hazelwood would like to win, we'll look at Tyreke Stevenson. For me, that's always been a Georgia and Miami recruitment. I know Florida is, in some aspects, he was committed to Florida at one time. Let's be very clear on that. And Florida was also his dream school at one point. But you look at Miami and Georgia, those have been consistently the schools he's been checking out. He's built the relationships with there, and he feels comfortable with. And you look at Miami's recruiting rankings now, they're down to 14 commitments in the class of 2019 on the 24/7 Sports Composite. And that national recruiting ranking right now is at 32. It is at 32. They only have 1 player they only have 3 players that's among the nation's top 200 prospects. That's not very good for a team that wants to contend for these players, especially a team that aspires to win championships going forward. So that's something that will definitely need to be monitored. It seems like, especially with the Diaz news now, it seems like Miami is definitely going in an opposite direction of what it would take to pull in guys like Stevenson and Hazelwood on January the 5th.
Well, I want to get too deep in the weeds on the Miami part of this, but, Jeff, if I'm thinking back correctly, this is going to end up being like the 3rd consecutive year, I'm talking about calendar year, where Miami's had something close to 20 decommitments. That's just sort of a weird program anyway, that they, hold commitments for as briefly as they do, and guys like Stevenson end up, at least from this show's perspective, hopefully choosing to go to school elsewhere. It's really kind of funny year after year after year how many decommitments Miami seems to get. It's different reasons. In this case, it may be Manny Diaz related, but this is a program that gets a lot of decommitments, is it not?
Yeah, let's be clear, Brandon. I think yesterday, Miami picked up a commitment, and they flipped the gentleman from Appalachian State. That just seems in a different recruiting lane. Miami here is definitely not in the express lane when it comes to his 2019 class. When I can imagine if there was a DawgNation Daily or turnoverchaindaily.com that was popping up today, and the headline was Miami flips a offensive line prospect from Appalachian State. Yeah, that's not good, man.
All right, so let me talk about a couple other things while we still have you on the phone here. I showed a tweet on the screen earlier and read it to our audience of McCole Hardman, who seems to be, at least according to the people who responded to the tweet, a lot of people were interpreting that as Hardman saying that he's going to come back for his senior season. Jeff, when it comes to these juniors who are going to contemplate one way or another, and I mean Hardman, Ridley, Nauta, there are probably others. When it comes to these guys, how important is this for Georgia in recruiting in terms of the number of players that Georgia can sign over the course of this 2019 cycle, having room for everybody they want to take? I don't mean to ask a crass question, but does Georgia need a couple guys to leave? I mean, when it comes to juniors going to the NFL, what impact will that have one way or another on recruiting here?
Well, it's simple math. If Georgia is to sign 24 or 25 prospects in this cycle, that includes, Tremel Walthorpe. He only counts once, and he can count towards last year's class. I think Georgia was about 84, 85 scholarships at the end of last season. Don't know if one of those players, one of the walk-ons, was awarded a scholarship for the 2018 season or not. That wasn't disclosed. So it's kind of got simple math. There's only 16 scholarships that are being vacated by graduating seniors. Georgia, if it wants to sign 24, 25 prospects, there needs to be 8 that are combined from early entries to the NFL and maybe guys that move on and decide they're never going to play at Georgia in their college career to flourish elsewhere. So you got to get to those 8 guys, 8 attrition numbers, whether it's, guys like Riley Ridley, who's definitely seen as a high upper echelon receiver prospect in this draft, Elijah Holyfield, Isaac Nauta. We've brought up Rodrigo Blankenship on your show before. Those are some candidates out there. So, it's a good thing when the Bulldogs want to go pro. You can always celebrate them as long as they're making the decision that they feel most comfortable with and it's best for their future. So if 3 or 4 Bulldogs go pro, then that only means maybe 3 or 4 Bulldogs maybe have to move on elsewhere in order to sign a full class. And then if no one moves on elsewhere, then that will determine how many prospects the Bulldogs can sign this year. It might be 21 or 22 instead of 24 or 25.
Yeah, that's a very interesting number crunch to watch there. Let me do one final thing before we let you go. We certainly appreciate your time on our program today. Obviously, Evan Neal got some attention earlier this week. He was at Georgia apparently last weekend. He showed it out on social media, on Twitter himself, wearing that Georgia uniform. And this is a name, Jeff, that I guess, and obviously you know the backstory of this stuff better than I do, so you may say it differently, but a name seemingly in which has risen very quickly with Georgia, a guy that I've just never really taken all that seriously, but, here we are heading towards the early signing period. He's tweeting out pictures of himself wearing a Georgia uniform. He tweeted out another picture a day or so ago of, that Georgia G mentioned among a long list of finalists for him when he makes his decision on TV next week. I told you before, offensive tackle at the high-end elite level, and certainly Neal would qualify as one of those. That's an area I'd love to see Georgia address with one of its remaining scholarship spots. I'll ask you the same version of a question I feel like I ask you a lot. How real is this? Is Georgia really possibly in on a guy like Evan Neal? Could they make this happen?
I'm going to take you back, Brandon. This is a time warp for me. I'm going to take you back to, I believe this was, I'm going to say August of 2016. I'm at IMG Academy for one of their media day sessions prior to their season. And, I'm there talking to Robert Beal, other guys like that. Trey Sanders and Evan Neal are there. And I can't remember if they were current commitments to Bama or recent decommitments from Bama. I think they were both committed to Bama. I spoke to them because I know that they were very high on Georgia's radar. They had offers. Georgia was the second school to offer Trey Sanders. And both of them basically told me the same thing. They told me that whatever direction their recruiting goes, they see schools like Alabama and Georgia being among their final list of to-the-end schools, the schools that will be in the thick of it for them until they finally put pen to paper and sign. So even with Trey Sanders, this is just G-Day, this is the recent official visit. This is just keeps accelerating the interest for Georgia. It's not creating interest in Georgia. These are deep-rooted attention spans and affections for the University of Georgia. Evan Neal has always kind of had Georgia among one of the schools that was deeply considering him, that he was deeply considering. Always liked Georgia a lot. I can remember Evan telling me how much he liked Georgia way back then in August of 2016. So this is some deep-rooted attachment to Georgia. But the same thing would exist there with Miami. We just spoke about Miami and Alabama. I think that the logical read right now on Evan Neal is Georgia would be, I wouldn't call it a luxury, but Georgia is having to reach a little bit farther to maybe try and pull in Evan Neal here at the last second than other schools. And, Alabama is obviously still very thick in that one. And I know everybody thinks about the tackle crunch, and they're smart, too, because Isaiah Wilson played so well. Andrew Thomas is an absolute professional prospect, a top 15 pick when he decides to come out. I have no doubt in my mind about that. So Georgia needs to load up on tackles. I will ask people to remember that Cade Mays wasn't originally a tackle. Owen Condon actually traveled for Georgia last year. I know Owen's not of the elite tackle mold, but the fact that he traveled and got on the field for Georgia late in the season said something to me. And then they're also adding Xavier Truss and Warren McClendon as it stands right now in that class. It's not that the cupboard won't be empty at tackle. It's just that this pursuit now of guys like Evan Neal and Darnell Wright it's definitely warranted.
Jeff, that is outstanding. Excellent analysis and information. We really appreciate that. We know at DawgNation.com and at the forum, at forum.DawgNation.com, you've got a lot of coming for us here in the days ahead. We love this time of year, and you help make it so much more enjoyable for all of us. We appreciate you being here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza, and we will look forward to talking to you more as this exciting time gets ready to unfold heading towards Wednesday.
All right, guys. It's a good stretch run through Wednesday. Look forward to it, everybody.
Thanks, Jeff.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I just thought that was great from Jeff. Really interesting backstory and how long Georgia and Evan Neal have been establishing their relationship together. That five-star offensive tackle will be quite an addition for Georgia if that indeed could happen. And obviously, I think I said this, on the air. There is a stretch in which, when you look at a lot of these names that are still out there, the Sanders, the Dean, the Neals, the Hazelwoods, the Stevensons. Of course, Hazelwood and Stevenson we won't find out about until the beginning of January. But, there's a way in which Georgia gets all five of these guys. There's a way in which Georgia gets none of these guys. And, the maybe more likely scenario is something kind of in between when it comes to that. So a lot of nail-biting, white-knuckling times coming up for Dog fans over the next few days, next couple of weeks. But really, really interesting. And, to go back to what Jeff said off the top about Nakobe Dean, the one thing I've always felt like was going to be Georgia's biggest challenge for Dean was the distance from his home. Horn Lake, Mississippi, near Memphis. Memphis is not close to here. Memphis is almost in Arkansas, for what it's worth. So, excuse me, I just sneezed. I don't think I've ever done that in the show. But nonetheless, Dean, is up there near Memphis. That's a long way from Athens. Tuscaloosa's closer. There's some thought for me that's always been like that geography is going to be difficult to combat when it comes to Dean. It's a long way from home. But what changes that is if Georgia feels more like home than the other schools potentially competing for services. If that's the case, then the distance from home is not going to be such a big deal because it feels like home once you get to Athens. And I joked about, the Alabama degree. The Dean family really values education. If they've done their homework on that Alabama engineering degree and feel good about that, then that's obviously probably something to take very seriously. I'm sure the Alabama side of this would use that as an explanation for why they think they're going to win with Dean. It does seem like Alabama fans remain confident here on Dean, much the same way some Georgia fans have kind of a hopeful optimism. It's going to be a fun one to watch. We'll pay close attention to it. As we transition into our SEC through, though, let me also remind you as we get ready to go with bowl season, my bookie, my friends from there, a great way to stay involved and enjoy this year's bowl season. You can get your action down on the over/under, on the point spread. You can make these December games a lot more fun to watch. And if you need to kind of take a break from your family and kind of get away and enjoy a little football, well, having a little action down with my bookie makes that all the better. And what's even better than that is right now when you make your first deposit, when you sign up for the first time, my friends at my bookie will match your first deposit up to 50%. That's like being a winner before you even start. But you got to go right now, and you got to use the promo code DawgNation. That's all one word, spelled the way it's supposed to be, DAWG. All one word with MyBookie. Use the promo code DawgNation. Your first deposit can be matched up to 50%. Then after that, you play, you win, you get paid. But you got to find MyBookie online. That's MyBookie, and then use the promo code DawgNation, and your first deposit can be matched 50%. We will talk about some of these bowls here in just a minute. Let me get a couple other stories, though, before we get to that. Matt Zenitz from AL.com has reported that Alabama has been using the services of the embattled, controversial former Maryland coach DJ Durkin as an analyst as of late. And this is obviously going to be met with, condemnation by a lot of forces out there. I know Dan Wolken from USA Today has already written a column about this, and I do think this is a bad look for Saban. Even though his coaching rehabilitation has become something of a joke. We've seen this with Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin. They tried it with Hugh Freeze. That kind of got shot down. We've seen Butch Jones even right now for very different reasons. We've seen a lot of coaches use the Alabama program almost like a car wash. They go in dirty, they come out clean, and I guess DJ Durkin now going to try to do the same kind of thing. The problem here with many people is that Durkin is not a guy that, maybe battled some personal demons the way that Sarkisian did, or maybe had some, jokes attached to his name the way that Butch Jones and Lane Kiffin have. This is a guy who was involved in a program where a player died. I don't mean to make this serious, or at least that serious, but this is a very serious situation. And, it's almost like Saban cares about other coaches so much so that he doesn't sometimes, think about, how his own program is potentially tarnished by being connected to a guy like this so quickly after he was just removed from his job in disgrace. And, frankly, this is one of those deals where, a network like ESPN is not going to highlight this as much as the non-ESPN entities will. I think they have a very cozy relationship with Saban. I think Saban's given them a lot of access, and I think in exchange for that, there is something of, at times, what appears to be some favorable coverage here. And, this is kind of one of those deals where I think Saban's made a misstep, and I don't think a lot of people at the highest levels of the national media are going to call him out for that as much as they probably should. Let me do a couple other things here real quick. Gus Malzahn met with reporters yesterday. Malzahn had a real job to do. He had to try to put a happy face on what has been kind of an ugly situation in Auburn. There have been a number of rumors that Auburn boosters fans wanted Malzahn out of the program, and they tried to alter the terms of his contract in a way of making the job seem less attractive. Malzahn says none of that is true. He also says that he's excited about calling plays in the future. I guess, what are you supposed to say if you're Malzahn? I think that there is a cloud hanging over Auburn that is not going to be satisfied by just one press conference and one happy face from the coach. There are a lot of very serious questions being asked about what's going on there right now. And is Malzahn going to be given the time to turn this around? And is he the person to get it done? This could be a very tumultuous offseason for Auburn that's worth paying attention to. I'll also mention that we do have bowl games starting this weekend. I'll run through a couple of these real quick. None of these are great games necessarily. Tulane, Louisiana, that's today, I guess, at 1:30. You got Utah State, North Texas tomorrow. Las Vegas Bowl's not bad. Arizona State, Fresno State. I love Fresno State in that game for what it's worth. Georgia Southern Eastern Michigan's also tomorrow as well. And then you got a bit of a UGA Bowl tomorrow night. Middle Tennessee State, a team that Georgia played this year, versus Appalachian State, a team that Georgia played last year. So between the Blue Raiders and the Mountaineers and Arizona State, Fresno State, Georgia Southern and Montgomery, it's actually not a bad first weekend of action here. I said that the Tulane, Louisiana game's today. That's tomorrow. All those games are tomorrow. So what, you got a total of, 5 bowl games tomorrow? So a great way to welcome back college football. Any Saturday with 5 college football games is not a bad Saturday, and that's indeed what we have tomorrow. And with that said, we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, I want to turn our attention back to recruiting just for a moment. I want to do our Marlowe's Minute. And I really want to focus back in on something that Jeff Sintel said when he joined us a moment ago. A lot of times Jeff, he's the objective reporter, right? He's got to consider every piece of information, and he's got to weigh them against each other. He's probably not quite as prone to the hot takes and just sort of spewing off at the mouth the way that maybe I am from time to time. But did you notice how clearly and quickly Jeff answered the question when I said, does the issue of Manny Diaz leaving Miami and the flood of decommits, the flurry of decommits that have happened from that program in the aftermath of that, does that have an impact on a guy like Tyreke Stevenson? And Jeff, pretty much as clearly and loudly as could be, said, yeah, it is. That is the kind of thing that he thinks Tyreke Stevenson's going to notice. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that Stevenson's not going to choose Miami because of that. Everybody's got their own reasons for choosing and doing what they do. But in terms of paying attention to what is a program right now that, as I thought Jeff said it very well, that would appear to be, at the moment, not on the rise. If anything, a lot of sideways energy, or if anything, a bit of a regression here at the end of Mark Richt's third season. That he thinks, Jeff Sentell thinks, that Tyreke Stevenson is going to notice that. Now, this is an important one for Georgia. It won't be determined next Wednesday. This will go all the way into January. But the stuff that's happening right now will certainly impact the decision that Stevenson makes public when he announces there at the beginning of January. To go back in time here for a moment, Tyreke Stevenson has taken a lot of high-profile visits to Georgia. He was at the event known as The Reveal, where the West End Zone facility was opened up for the first time. He admitted there, at that moment, he was tempted to commit to UGA there on the spot, decided to wait, wanted to be more deliberate with his process. Obviously, Miami was one of the schools he was strongly considering around that. But this is also a guy that likes Georgia a lot and talked to Jeff Sentell not too long ago about what it is about Georgia, the vibe, the feeling that he gets that he likes so much. Here's the four-star defensive back Tyreke Stevenson as a part of our Marlowe's Minute, given the fact that Miami, one of the schools that he's considering, is facing a good bit of turmoil right now. Here is Stevenson.
The way the team on the rise, how the team connects as a brotherhood. And the coaching, just Georgia, it's real peaceful. And then the facility is great. All the recruiters and everybody just in the facility is always in a good mood. So I like that. That's one thing I like about Georgia.
So I love that from Tyreke Stevenson, that it's peaceful. Everyone's in a good mood. I mean, truly compare that to the situation in Miami right now, where if you go to a Miami message board, it does not appear like everyone down there is in a good mood right now. There are a lot of fingers being pointed about an offense that's not very good and a defensive side of the ball that just lost its defensive coordinator. It would certainly seem that Georgia is a lot more peaceful in comparison to that. And compare this to what we started our show with Nakobe Dean saying, you know what, there's a homey feel at Georgia. It seems like Stevenson feels the same way. Obviously, we know Clay Webb was influenced with that same kind of stuff when it comes to Sam Pittman. That is the vibe that Georgia's giving off to recruits right now. And I can't promise you that Georgia's going to win every single one of these battles, but it is certainly putting its best foot forward, making its best possible pitch. And next Wednesday, or at least in Stevenson's case into January, these could be very interesting decisions to watch unfold. All right, we shall get ready to wrap up here. We appreciate you being a part of our program here today as we head towards the weekend. It's always kind of a nice time to check in and see our Gator Hater updater. Of course, Georgia going head-to-head with Florida for a few recruits here as well, including Trey Sanders, as Jeff talked about. And don't forget, it has now been 776 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs, have had anything to brag about when it comes to this series. Maybe that's a pretty good number for guys like Sanders and others to keep in mind here. Our Gatorade Updater on DawgNation Daily, presented by Marco's Pizza. Let me also say congratulations going out. Georgia does have its gala last night, awarding a lot of end-of-season awards. Permanent captain's name for the season, Jonathan Ledbetter coming away one of those, Jake Fromm, Elisha Holyfield. A great group of awards. You can read more about that at DawgNation.com. But a great night for a lot of UGA players. We'll see you on Monday once again for DawgNation Daily. Y'all have a great weekend. And on video, really appreciate that. Great comments here today. We got some time to get a few more of your comments in on both Facebook and YouTube. I do have to get out something close to on time today. We got a lot going on around here, but I'm going to try to knock out as many comments as I can. I do believe I started on YouTube yesterday, so let me start on Facebook here today. Eric Patton says about Alabama, they said about Webb, he's been committed to Georgia for a while and had a hold off on making it public right before the early signing period to try to gain momentum. I think my issue on that is this thing of that's Georgia trying to create the appearance of momentum. I think it's pretty obvious from looking around a lot of the recruiting battles that Georgia's got its own set of momentum. Webb's just another example of that. I think that's also an example of, in some cases, even though Alabama's beaten Georgia the last 2 years, Kirby Smart still occupies a good bit of real estate in the heads of a lot of Alabama fans. Hayes Calloway says the Dogs going to be champs next year. Boy, Hayes, it's good to have you checking in on the program, and I sure do hope you're right about that. Guido Devlin says that they're just mad because they lost Webb, and I think there is some of that going on with some of the Alabama folks. Justin and Michelle McGee says, BA, are you going to try to cover any announcements live on December 19th? We absolutely are. We had a meeting about that yesterday, trying to figure out where we can be, where we can get some cameras positioned. Obviously, we'll do, what we want to try to do is do as many as we can. So what we're trying to do is, is there a way to do a lot of these, have different people set up at different places so we can capture a lot of those? We're trying to get that organized. So we're definitely going to be planning on doing a lot on Wednesday. Beyond just the regular broadcast, we'll have a lot of extra coverage there that day. As we get a little closer to knowing who's going to be where and what's going to be what, we'll start telling you a little bit more about that. Trey Duke says we should replace the Gator Hater Updater with a Bama Hater Countdown. Around here, the Gator Hater Updater is still a pretty sacred piece of the program, but there's still plenty of energy and motivation to go around towards beating Alabama. I can promise that. Wesley Hooks checking in from South Carolina. Wesley, appreciate that. Chip Gromlich asking about a couple guys on scholarship. That's one of those things that I know that Jeff Sintel will be crunching in terms of, will we see players leave? Will we see players decide to go somewhere else? And does that free up some scholarships? One way or another, if Georgia wants to get up to that close to that 24 number, somebody's going to have to be gone, it would certainly seem. Somebody's going to have to. Eric Moody says, guaranteed Saban had his 2 commits announced right after Tua lost the Heisman to keep the momentum going. Yeah, I mean, Eric does bring up a good point here, is that timing is always used as a weapon when it comes to recruiting. And if Webb really was going to choose Georgia for a while, now there were a lot of people at Clemson. The funny thing is, it only became Georgia-Alabama at the end. It was thought to be Georgia-Clemson for a while. But if Georgia didn't know it had Webb for a while and it picked this time to encourage him to go public, that's not a weapon that other programs have not used before. So that's also a really good point. John Ruffin checking in from Augusta. Great group of dog fans over there on the east side of the state. We appreciate that. Over here on YouTube, Jim Waddell talking about the early years of the Kirby era at Georgia compared to the early years of the Saban era at Alabama. I mean, certainly it does speak for itself in terms of, the quick transformation that Kirby's going through here. And a lot of the Alabama folks would like to tell you, that they're not worried about Kirby at all and that they've, beaten Georgia these last 2 years. But there is no denying that they have seen that Georgia is very quickly going through a transformation. And if Georgia does get some of these names that are kind of floating out there, as Jeff said, those will be the missing pieces in a lot of ways that could allow Georgia to win that national championship. Now, if Alabama wins these head-to-head battles, then you'll shake their hand, give them credit for it, and you'll roll your sleeves and go back to work for the next class. Because either way, Georgia's not going anywhere. They're going to still keep fighting and battling. But what happens on signing day is predictive for what happens on the field. There's a long list of history around the SEC that proves that. And clearly, Georgia is building something every single year. 2019 is going to be another example of that allows it to be even more of a formidable challenge to UGA. I should say to Alabama. BA's daddy on YouTube says, I want Gus Malzahn to stay at Auburn. That's the best thing for the dogs. Daily. Our buddy Dennis Wilson, who's a little bit of a, somehow he's a Miami fan that's in the comment section every day. I want to read this comment. He says, K9 Blues, another one of our YouTube commenters. He says, BA, I pray for you and K9 Blues every day at Bible study with Mark Richt. Congratulations on the last 12 months worth of disasters. Come on, Dennis. If you really are a Miami fan, which I believe you are, what's going on down there with your program right now? Come on now. Angelo P. says Saban came in without a top-tier program to compete against. So that's obviously in reference to what we were just saying about the first couple of years for Saban, the first couple of years for Kirby. So, Alabama had been more down prior to 2007 than Georgia had been prior to 2016. But Georgia had also been, even in those years, not exactly competing for national championships, not exactly really even competing for the SEC championship. Kirby's transformation has been pretty absolute, because if you look back to like years like 2013 and 2014, when Georgia probably did have the most talent in the SEC East, but still lost the division to teams like Missouri, what Kirby did, last year, getting Georgia to an SEC championship and having Georgia kind of back in that national conversation again this year, I mean, that is a pretty stark contrast where the program was prior to 2016. I never know if this is Clock or C-Lock on YouTube. I think he's probably told me before, and I just never remember. Says that Hardman and Nada will be back. They need to improve their draft stock. You may be right about that. I think that different guys have different ways of going about their deliberations when it comes to some of this kind of stuff. If I had to guess, and I don't obviously know, this is just my assumption, the junior for Georgia most likely to leave, I believe, is probably Riley Ridley. If I had to guess the most likely one to leave, that's who I would guess, but I don't 100% know. Let me go back over to Facebook here for a moment. Y'all still give me a hard time about Klondike. I guess I need to confess that to Jeff Sintel at some point in time, because Jeff is very well versed in all the top hip hop stars. I, as many of you know, am not. So I guess I've got to at some point in time give him a chance to mock me and laugh at me for my conflation of Kodak with Klondike. Darnell Ballard says, "Is Nakobe Dean going to Alabama?" Darnell, we're gonna have to wait and find that out for sure. We're indeed gonna find that out. Somebody brings up pass rushing. Who brought this up? Brian Nally says, "I think we need to get our pass rush better." Well, the good news is, Brian, that is indeed what Georgia is trying to address with its 2019 class. Just saw a recent tweet from Jermaine Johnson, the JUCO transfer, who's about to show up here on campus, much like Clay Webb is about to start going through some practices. We may see Jermaine Johnson get his practice career started here in the lead up to the Sugar Bowl. Obviously, Nolan Smith, another terrific pass rushing prospect, nation's #1 prospect, arguably for the class of 2019. He has shut his recruitment down. He's coming to Georgia. So at least with those two names alone, those are guys that could be immediate impact pass rushers for Georgia next season. Statistically speaking, I don't dispute what you're saying at all, that Georgia's got to get better at wreaking havoc in the backfield, tackles for loss, sacks, quarterback pressures, all of that. And I think those two names, Johnson and Smith, next year both give Georgia a real chance to be improved in that category. Steve Shafini says about my hip-hop knowledge. He says, I don't know much about hip-hop either, but I did get your earlier reference to The Who. Well, I'm glad to know about that, Steve. Thanks so much. Glad to see that. John William Adams says, the juniors staying will be our biggest recruiting win each and every year. It's really important to have those veteran guys come back. I will say that the 2019 roster is a little bit different than the 2017 roster, though, in that this is already a much deeper roster than it was going into 2017. Obviously, I love all these juniors as a fan, and I would love to see them wearing red and black again next year. But as Georgia gets better as a program, as it grows and evolves, needing seniors to stay is going to be less relevant of a conversation every single year, because who's coming into your program is more important than who's going out. And there is something that actually boosts the attractiveness of your program to recruits when you say this is a, come here and learn for a year as a freshman, develop as a sophomore, and go out and dominate as a junior. That becomes a real big selling point. So obviously Georgia doesn't go to the playoff in 2017 without its seniors, but as Georgia grows from that point, I think that seniors will be less important for UGA. And there are, admittedly, in 2019, just less room for seniors on the roster than there was in 2017. So there is a balancing act you got to figure out there. I think there definitely is a balancing act you got to figure out there. Matt Rukavina says he wants to talk Zeus. So, Matt, that's a good question. If I missed your comment earlier, I do apologize for that. I'm assuming this is in comparison to a guy like Trey Sanders, someone like that. And the honest truth is, in terms of a healthy Zamir White or a Trey Sanders where you come to the program, or a year older James Cook who's gotten some experience that Zamir White wasn't able to get, I just don't think we know how that would play out. I think we do know this, is that at Georgia there's always going to be room for at least 3 running backs. And Holyfield, who, won the strength and conditioning award last night at the gala, was one of the permanent captains of the team. If you, that's a guy that's going to have an NFL decision to consider. And if he were to move on, then that spot as the number 2 back at Georgia becomes open. If he stays, then he probably holds on to that, and along with DeAndre Swift, and that spot as the number 3 running back ends up being open. And maybe it's Zamir White, and maybe it's Trey Sanders. I guess it could be James Cook, and then Brian Herrien potentially is still in the mix there as well. I just think the running back position has a way of working itself out. And I think not knowing what the pecking order would be is not necessarily a bad thing. And having a lot of very interesting names vying for those spots is also a pretty good spot to be. It's fun for the fans to watch unfold, but it's also crucial for Georgia to have that kind of depth. So I think it's one of those deals where Georgia doesn't really have a plan in place. It's saying, let's collect as many good players as we can at every single position. Let's see who can stay healthy, and let's see who can go out there and prove their value and worth. Travis Ellis referencing the possibility of a transfer. Obviously, given the new rules that are in place and given the mood around college football, the chances of Georgia losing some players that haven't played a lot is at least a possibility. It is. Although, if you go back and reread all of Jeff's freshman reports from the season, he would write that every single game. The travel roster did get a little interesting at the end of the year, and the participation reports also got a little interesting too in terms of guys by the end of the year who had not been playing at the beginning of the year were actually playing more and a little more involved. So I think that, there may be a few obvious names of, well, so-and-so hasn't played. He's probably going to go look for somewhere else to go, and that may indeed happen. But if you really look at who was playing in those final games of the regular season, some of the guys you may assume that weren't kind of were. So pay close attention to that, if that made any sense at all. Let me go back over to YouTube, then I got to get ready to go. Ty Middlebrook, very confident that Zamir White will be fine come September. Ty, I do believe that Zamir is going to put his best foot forward towards a terrific recovery process. I would expect that to happen. Cliff Payne says, I'd be surprised if Zamir White plays more than 2 years with the ACL injury he's already had. Cliff, I am more optimistic than that. I think that now if you're meaning only 2 years at Georgia and then uses that to go on in the NFL, I'll always believe that NFL teams are going to be attracted to guys who haven't gotten a lot of carries. Even if one of the reasons why White didn't get carries is because of an injury, I think ultimately, you compare, one of these SEC running backs that plays in a deep roster to one of these Big Ten running backs that gets, 40 carries a game for 4 years. I don't know that the NFL is all that excited about that kind of prospect. Someone who's already used up most of the tread off their tire before they even get to the NFL. I think backs at places like Georgia where they've shared carries and been a part of depth, I think the NFL really likes those kinds of guys. Jermaine Dunbar Trucking says, BA, why does ESPN hate Georgia? So let me say this a couple different ways. First of all, and I actually talked to a couple of y'all about this on Twitter, I think some of y'all need to give Kirk Herbstreit a little bit of credit for how much he spoke up on Georgia's behalf after the playoff announcement. I mean, Herbstreit really put himself out there on Georgia's, for Georgia's benefit, and a lot of the Georgia fans that I saw on Twitter after that still weren't showing him any love. Now, I'm not telling you need to all of a sudden make Herbstreit your presidential vote simply because of what he said, but words should matter. So in this notion that ESPN hates Georgia, at least give Herbstreit a little credit. Even Jesse Palmer, the Florida guy, was showing a little love towards Georgia. Guys like Marcus Spears kind of doing the same thing. So as an entity, I can't really speak for ESPN, but a couple of the ESPN analysts did really tout Georgia in a big way around the college football playoff. And ultimately, here's what I believe is true. I don't believe that ESPN hates Georgia. What I believe is that ESPN is obviously just going to give its audience what it expects to see. People don't like to be surprised in sports television. And Alabama's been there for a long time. Saban has become this huge name brand. So there is going to be, at times, probably a little more favorable coverage of Alabama just because that's what the expectation is. Sports has a way of being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Alabama's been on the national stage. The people that tune into sports expect to see Alabama once again on that national stage. Otherwise, what they're looking on their screen can feel weird and confusing. So I don't know that ESPN hates Georgia as much as it's just very comfortable touting Alabama. I do think the College Football Selection Committee hates the SEC. I don't think it hates Georgia in particular, but Georgia, given its status right now as, unfortunately, the number 2 program in the SEC, behind Alabama, likely ahead of everybody else, the team that's going to feel the brunt of most that's going to be Georgia right now. Because in that discussion of should there be 2 SEC teams in the playoff, when Georgia is that second SEC team, they're going to feel, the onslaught of most of, I don't know if it's a bias or a, or what. It's just an entity that, for the most part, the selection committee that exists, try to make the wealth a little bit more spread out. Get other regions of the country involved in the college football playoff, and a team like Georgia that doesn't have the conference championship but does have, the credentials of calling itself one of the 4 best teams, Georgia's just going to get stung by that. Thank you, Tremaine, for your comment, and appreciate the kind words. Let me get a couple more. K9 Blues on the subject of David Pollack. I mean, I think that David does a really good job on ESPN. And, I do think that a lot of those guys do have tough jobs in that when they don't say something about their, alma mater, fans get mad. When they say something about somebody else, people get mad about that too. I'll give Herbstreit an example. This is not me, touting for Kirk Herbstreit, because I've had, a million problems with him over the course of, the years for just various things. Anybody who gives opinions for a living, he's going to upset people from time to time. But here's the specific instance with Kirk Herbstreit. This is a guy that lived in Columbus, Ohio for all his life, eventually moved away from Columbus. I think he lives in Nashville now, moved away from Columbus because it just got to be so tough with him with Ohio State fans always complaining about what he said about Ohio State. So you had Ohio State fans so upset with him that he had to move out of the town, and yet you've got a scenario where most of the country says he's just so biased in favor of Ohio State that nothing he says can be taken seriously. That is an example of when you get to the highest level of ESPN college football analysis, you can't win. You literally can't please your alma mater fans. You can't please the fans of people outside your alma mater. When you give opinions, you're just going to make people mad. And so from that standpoint, I do have a little sympathy for how hard that job is. Kid asks a good question. BA, why is it that it costs so much more to see Georgia play than any other team play? It is amazing how expensive this Georgia stuff continues to be. I saw some data where the Sugar Bowl is already non-playoff bowls, like the second highest bowl on the secondary market right now. I mean, that's crazy. This is, I don't want to say a glorified exhibition, but this is not one of these games along the lines of, what Georgia's been doing the last, couple of seasons. Now, part of the Sugar Bowl ticket price is probably also driven up by Texas, who has not been to a game like this in a long time. There will be a lot of Texas fans in New Orleans for that game. Geographically, I'm also assuming it's a good bit closer, although admittedly I don't know how many miles it is between New Orleans and Austin, but I'm assuming it's a good bit closer. But either way, this is another example of a Sugar Bowl ticket. Georgia's already sold all of its allotment, where this Sugar Bowl ticket's a little bit of a hot bowl ticket once again. Georgia fans are just insatiable. They cannot get enough football, and I love the role that I'm in, getting a chance to speak to them every day and all of you every day because of your passion. And the unfortunate byproduct of that is when it comes to things that cost money, the passion of Georgia fans shows up in higher prices. Travel is expensive. Tickets are expensive. It's just, the apparel doesn't go on sale at stores very much because it sells out before it does. This is just one of those deals where all of the love that all of you have for the sport and for the team have created quite an economy around the program. Let us get ready to go. We have got some stuff we got to take care of. Let me jump in here and get a couple more Facebook. Jennifer Caldwell Sperlin on the subject of expanding the playoffs. Jennifer, I would expect we see more and more of that kind of talk coming up. And it's kind of funny. I saw on Twitter some sort of quote from Greg McGarity where it seems like he's kind of against that. I don't know. I mean, I think this is probably posturing on the part of the athletic directors to raise the price of the new playoff when it comes around. You need to say that you're against it so that the TV networks will pay you more money to do it. But in terms of an actual 8-team playoff, I think it would benefit Georgia. Now, if you ever went to 32 teams, that'd probably hurt the SEC. But going from 4 to 8, I think benefits the SEC. Mark Colicchio says it was nice to meet you in New Orleans. Yeah, we are looking forward to being back there, Mark, and look forward to seeing you there again. Beautiful city, great place to be on New Year's Eve, heading to New Year's Day. It was great to meet you then. We'll look forward to seeing you back there again coming up in January. Amos Williams wants to black out the Sugar Bowl. I think a lot of Georgia fans probably agree with that. Chris Garcia talking about the playoff devaluing the SEC championship game. Expanded playoffs potentially could do that, I guess. You can make a case that, it's the SEC championship game is not what it once was when one team has to win it, the other team doesn't. That's probably fair. All right. Really appreciate the comments. Really good stuff. Heading towards signing day, don't forget Jeff Sintel will have a lot for you at DawgNation.com and on the forum at forum.DawgNation.com. I'll be back on Monday. We'll recap whatever's out there in terms of the rumor mill from some of these final weekends worth of visits before early period begins on Wednesday. Hope you all have a great weekend. If you're heading towards some holiday plans, hope you get ready to enjoy those with friends and family. I'll see you back to Monday morning at 10 a.m. for another episode of DawgNation Daily Live presented by Marco's Pizza. Hope you have a great weekend. We'll look forward to seeing you then.